Today I'm hosting Olivia Lazar, a Carnegie Europe Fellow, to talk about the blind spots of the green energy transition, about the environmental cost of the rare mineral and rare earth extraction, about the new global struggle for resources between, on the one hand, US and the European Union, and on the other hand, China, about the concept of the zones of sacrifice and the idea of accepting environmental degradation in certain countries or regions of the world, for example, Serbia and its prospective lithium mining, to assure a greener future for all.
Olivia Lazar is a researcher and an environmental peacemaking expert. She has over 12 years of experience in the peacemaking sector at field and policy levels. Through fieldwork, she came to observe how the plundering of ecosystems feeds conflicts across the world and how it contributes to climate disruptions. As a fellow at Carnegie Europe, Olivia focuses her efforts on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, as well as the risks of conflict associated to climate change and environmental collapse. Prior to joining Carnegie Europe, Olivia set up her own consultancy firm, Peace in Design Consulting, which remains exclusively active in conflict and fragile zones.
So, Olivia, in the past decades, we had other famous French public intellectuals coming to Belgrade, and they were, with no exception, older gray men. Today, I'm proud to host a new, more diverse, and I would say definitely much more exciting generation of French public intellectuals that you represent.
Thank you.
So it's a great honor to have you with us. And I would like to kick off with asking you what's at stake when we talk about the green energy transition and critical mineral rare earth extraction.
Yeah. Plenty. Let's maybe start with some figures. The latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out in late 2021 and early 2022. They told us that we are headed towards catastrophic scenarios for climate change, and one of the most concerning figures was when they told us that we may be hitting 1.5 of global warming compared to pre-industrial levels as early as 2025. And at the same time, more recently, there's been a paper by Tim Lenton, Johan Roekström, and another set of scientific authors telling us that we really cannot surpass 1.5 degrees of global warming, lest we essentially sort of, create a tipping point domino effect. And the tipping point domino effect is essentially like losing certain key aspects of how the planet functions from a stability perspective, losing the Amazon, losing, the AMOC, this sort of oceanic, I don't usually, have the right terms to explain this,
Mm.
fully in scientific terms, but the belt essentially that is within the Atlantic Ocean that allows to stabilize certain levels of carbon absorption and temperature stabilization. So we need to decarbonize. There is no question about this, and we need to decarbonize fast. But we also need to decarbonize well, because as you said in your introduction, it's not as if shifting to a different energy and industrial system comes without costs. If we want to shift from a fossil energy system, we need to go towards a mineral energy system. And we need a whole lot of different types of materials and a huge quantity of different types of materials that are found in different places in the world. So that means mines. Right. And mines are environmentally destructive, right? As much as we can improve on the technology to try and make them as little invasive as possible, they do remain fairly destructive. So we need to make sure that we, one, do not plunder the planet on our way to decarbonization. We need to prioritize essentially what needs to happen in terms of global public good regimes for energy provision, so as to ensure that nobody is left behind, that everybody has indeed resilient energy systems to function from an economic perspective. And we need to be careful about making sure that we don't go into over-consumerism, for example, with electric vehicles that will, create more and more demand for more and more materials over time, even counting for recycling rates. So that's one, making sure that essentially we respect the planet, that we ensure planetary security, that we understand where to mine and where not to mine, and that has to do with ecological sensibility. But then there is another part which is a lot more geopolitical in nature.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So who is winning the global battle for these resources? The West or China?
There are different aspects of this notion of winning, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's about reorganizing supply chains. And supply chains are very complex. They start at extraction base, and then they go on to processing, and then to clean tech development, and then to exports, and therefore creating markets. From an extraction and processing perspective, China is extremely well advanced. One of the key things about the geo-economic rise to power of China has been that they have managed to vertically integrate supply chains for rare earths extraction, from extraction to processing, to clean tech development, and then to export. Mm-hmm. This is very important because rare earths are necessary for wind turbines. They're necessary for magnets. They're necessary for military equipment as well. We're talking about a number of different sectors that are heavily dependent on China. The European Union, for example, is over 98%, I think, dependent on China, or over 90% now dependent on China for rare earths provision. And for other types of materials, such as lithium, China dominates the processing at over 60% of the global markets. So there is very clearly an ability, essentially, of China to yield a certain sort of power regarding how to instrumentalize supply chains, possibly weaponize them. We've seen that in the past, particularly in disputes between Japan and China, but also more recently, during the height of the COVID pandemic, when Australia requested to have some investigation within China about the origins of COVID, all of a sudden we had some narrative coming from China saying, "Are you sure you want to do that? Because we've got a lot of rare earths that you're dependent upon and a lot of processing capacity that you're very dependent upon."
That's interesting. And is this present situation of, we can say, a certain dominance of China in some aspects of it reversible?
Not entirely. But let's say that if we depart from the assumption, one of our colleagues that we know quite well, Janka Ertel from the European Council for Foreign Relations, has been part of the people who have coined this notion of systems rivalry, right? We're facing essentially a fracture in the rules-based order, in globalization, in the way in which we understand global trade and global politics. And there is one pole in that systems rivalry, which comes from China, where there is some cooperation with Russia. But we can understand essentially that within that systems rivalry, there is different sectors of competition. One aspect that I'm very concerned about is the level of extraction, because we're seeing essentially a lot of maneuvering on the part of Chinese actors, and for that matter, Russian actors, to gain access to deposits which are going to become imminently important in the next 5 years, but also in the next 20 years for all the critical raw materials. And the countries and the regions which are at the heart of this sort of maneuvering are in Africa, Latin America, in the Balkans, in Central Asia, and in the Indo-Pacific. And this is something that the European Union and the United States and other countries, I would say, in the OECD have not seen coming. They didn't keep the pulse on this. So there is essentially one aspect where there is already quite a lot of advancement in that particular regard with regards to extraction and sort of, deposits investments. It can be reversible. It depends on fluctuation of markets. It doesn't mean essentially that companies that are more associated usually or traditionally with the OECD space cannot try to gain access to other sorts of materials or deposits in the world. And parts of the competition is not just about the extraction aspect. It is also about the clean tech development, which includes innovating on as clean and effective technologies as possible in terms of solar panels, in terms of batteries, in terms of electrification, et cetera, and making sure that they're the least materially intensive as possible, which is the key challenge, essentially, of how we move into the era of decarbonization.
Yeah.
And on this, and I'll just finish, this is one pole where the European Union is actually quite advanced. We do have a lot of patents introduction regarding clean tech development. There is a huge amount of discussions about how to reduce the material footprint, not quite as much as I'd like to see, but still quite a lot. In the European Union, and we have essentially an ability to try and sort of look at how to reform economic metabolism, consumerism and productivism within the European Union, and how to sort of reform the way in which we use the single market to create valuable partnerships in the future that are not just about extraction and that are not just about transactional types of partnerships.
Right. But for the moment, to an extent, they are. And I would like to talk about the local cost of critical mineral extraction, for example. You were following the environmental protests in Serbia that forced the government to put a halt to Rio Tinto lithium mining project in the country earlier this year. And together we visited the future site of the mine. And we talked to local activists. And how would you sum up, let's say, the local situation in Serbia? What's at stake?
So there are different levels. The first level, which we need to recognize, is essentially that if you find a mine in an area like Jadar, which has historically been associated with agriculture, and therefore emotional attachment to the land, livelihoods, and a certain, vision of how to create a society which is very much soil-related. And if we find lithium and borate in that land, and if there is a possibility of moving towards an industrial landscape, this is a shock. This is a sense of grieving. This is a sense of loss. The very first thing that needs to happen is making sure that there is a healthy debate about what the prospects of the mine would be in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of social changes, in terms of political governance, and to look at the costs and the benefits of moving towards an industrial landscape. And then to decide collectively at the local level, but also with the government, whether or not this is something which is desirable. And there are many things that go into that conversation, many technical conversations that need to happen, but also value-oriented ones. And we cannot have essentially a decision, and this is usually the case in all countries that I've visited where there is a decision to make, right? Like everybody knows that with decarbonization, there are new economic opportunities that will accrue to demand-driven countries, such as, for example, in the European Union, and then host countries which would bear the brunt, essentially, of some mining. And you cannot have a discussion which is essentially just saying, like, well, we have a planning at the national government, and we're not going to consult, essentially, the people in the local areas about what the costs are going to be. That's one. Yeah. But the second part, and this relates back to the question around geopolitics, there needs to be an understanding of what's at stake here. When we visited Jadar, for example, the other day, there was, one person who struck me saying, "We're green here. We don't need to move towards a greener agenda," which, as this person was saying, is more related to the European Union and their consumption on electric vehicles and stuff like this. But let's, while I completely understand this, let's be very clear about the collective fate that we're facing. As I was saying before, we're rapidly headed towards a threshold of global warming, which if we pass it, is going to be catastrophic for everybody. And we can lose time pointing fingers at whose historical responsibility it is. But it's not going to help us in terms of understanding what are the new partnerships, what are the new energy, resilient systems, what are the new type of economic metabolisms that we need to put into place in order to pull together towards a future that will stabilize societies. If we don't, and I'm not saying that the lithium mine in Jadar should open, because once again it's a question of self-determination of the Serbs, and particularly of the people living on this land. But if we don't move towards mining lithium in Jadar or elsewhere, we will not make it. And we will remain dependent on fossil energy systems that will destabilize every single civilization on the face of this earth. We will not be able to have productive and fertile systems in Jadar, for example, for a really long time into the future. This place will not remain green and stable and productive and fertile.
In any case.
Yeah.
You were talking about the industrial landscape.
Yeah.
And because Rio Tinto seems to claim that extraction of jadarite, so lithium and borite, is possible without environmental damage. Is this really possible?
I would be careful. So there are different ways of understanding this saying. Usually when people talk about lithium mining, the things that we have in mind is pictures of the salares, for example, in Chile. You know, like the lithium brines, essentially, with all those beautiful shapes
of the moon. Yeah.
Exactly. Or we tend to think of open pit mines, which are incredibly environmentally destructive. It's really quite literally sort of, digging up into the earth.
Yeah, we saw it in your excellent TED talk.
There you go.
Visuals of that.
Absolutely, which is related to copper. In the case of Jadar, what I've observed in terms of the project which would be planned by Rio Tinto, if it is allowed in the future, is essentially trying to build a mine which is underground, going under the aquifers, trying to extract as much of this concentrate of lithium and borate, which the particularity of Jadar, and this is really important, is that there is enough concentration to justify essentially a sort of long-term mine of about 50 years, which is going to extract as much, like lithium hydroxide and carbonate and borate as possible, compared to other places where the concentration in the earth is much less important. So this is one aspect. And parts of that concentration defines the way in which the technology is going to be deployed in a place like Jadar. So technically, from what I'm observing, Rio Tinto is investing a lot of money to try and make this mine as state-of-the-art as possible. But it doesn't remove the fact, and even people from what I've observed at Rio Tinto, it doesn't remove the fact that mining is destructive. And the destruction is essentially going to happen here, at about 300 meters underground. Supposedly, it can keep up the agricultural base above, the mine. In some places where there is no refinery, plant which is installed. And then there is a projection that within 40 or 50 years, at the exit of the mine, there would be a lot of remediation and regeneration processes that would be put into place. So there is a possibility to limit and mitigate the environmental damage, but not right away. It's something which is on the longer term. So obviously it doesn't speak to people living on the land today, right? It's this is logical.
And also you talked about the local conversations that need to happen.
Yeah.
Local conversations presuppose democracy. And also, with all the goodwill, if we presume that there is, of an investor, in this case, Rio Tinto investors work with local subcontractors.
Yeah.
The entire chain of extraction, processing, production is conditioned by the rule of law.
Yeah.
So to make sure that actually everything happens as planned and that everything is as state-of-the-art as possible, this would presuppose that the laws on the country are functioning. And I wanted to ask you, without making any judgments here on my side, but is there a possibility to venture into this kind of a project with a greater value for local communities? So if we accept global, let's say, environmental, in this case, degradation, that it will happen at a certain point, is there a chance that the local communities get more than parts of the 5% of the mining rent that we have for the moment in Serbia? Are there examples in the world where this is done in a sort of a public-private partnership between the state and the mining companies?
There are examples around the world. And what I'm observing, and so you know that I don't know Serbia well, right? So I'm going to try and speak about the little that I know of Serbia, and then try to make comparisons with what I know of the sector and the stakes that we're facing. We need to think essentially of any type of new mining ventures coming into any country as something which goes beyond the royalties that you were mentioning, which are about 5%, and more than just the tax structure, which is associated to how a company, for example, like Rio Tinto, would pay like 40% of taxes to local governance systems. Right. We need to think of a mining actor as an actor that is going to have a responsibility towards local counterparts. This is the notion of social license to operate, but also within the context of a global energy transition, a responsibility which goes beyond, and which has to do with climate adaptation, with energy development, with a lot of different investments that actors in the private sector could and should do, especially, again, in the context of an energy transition, where no single public actor will be able to put all the bucks on, on the table to try and sort of push towards climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and stuff like this. So one of the things that I find quite encouraging, for example, about what's been happening in Serbia and the level of mobilization through the protests, through a number of different parties that have been sort of asking the government to organize debates to try and be more transparent, and how they turned also to Rio Tinto to be more transparent, is that it shows a level of conscience around environmental issues. There is an educational base which is extremely vibrant to try and push on checks and balances that are the foundation of any democratic system. And what that means is that essentially, if you start looking into the mining code in Serbia, into the various laws related to the extractive sectors, into this particular sort of chapter of critical materials that are now introduced in many different countries to try and reap as many benefits as possible from the energy transition, then you need to start looking at what are the components that a private sector actor needs to respect and that needs to be in partnership with the government and with the local people that will ensure that the economic value accrues to people who are part of this host community. That means looking at what we call local content. Local content is essentially how you're going to rely on subcontractors, for example. But in the case of Serbia, if there is a worry, a concern about who is being subcontracted, whether or not they're legitimate in terms of their savoir-faire for any type of industrial or infrastructure development, construction, and that kind of thing, then the local content law needs to go and be accompanied by a certain sense of research, transparency of information about on what basis are subcontractors being chosen, how do they feed into an economy and power distribution at the highest level, and do we make sure that actually the introduction of this actor, which will create an economic value, will not just accrue from the bottom up, but really indeed sort of create an economy at the level of the government which is going to be socioeconomically redistributed. And one last thing, and this is really important in the case of Serbia as well, because of the proximity with the European Union, but also with the proximity with Russia and to a certain extent the sort of more distant proximity with China.
Right.
Any conversation that that we have about extraction needs to be accompanied fundamentally by a conversation which is about how to develop economic, industrial, and clean tech ecosystems. In other words, the whole point of having such good lithium and borate in Serbia is not just about the lithium and the borate. It's essentially how do you tap into this to try and be part of the leaders of the clean tech revolution, which will help in terms of how do you electrify? How do you move into climate mitigation? How do you move into climate adaptation? And this is important because we all know that Serbia is one of the countries that has one of the highest air pollution rates in the world.
Yeah, look, today the situation is just atrocious. So, Olivia, thank you very much for shedding some external light, I would say, on our local polarized debate on this issue. I think we learned a lot from our conversation here.
I hope so.
And we are looking forward to reading you and listening to you in the future as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Srđan.
Thank you. Thank you.